Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her silver Honda Civic and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The small town of Millbrook seemed peaceful enough, with its tree-lined streets and modest houses that spoke of working families trying to make honest livings. She had moved here 3 months ago, seeking the quiet life she had dreamed of during her years of service. After 2 decades in the Navy, including 8 years as a SEAL, she was ready to blend into civilian life and find the peace that had eluded her for so long. The local coffee shop, Morning Brew, had become her daily ritual. She enjoyed the simple pleasure of ordering the same medium coffee with cream, no sugar, and sitting by the window to watch the town wake up. The barista, a young woman named Emma with bright pink hair, always greeted her with a genuine smile that reminded Sarah why she had fought so hard to protect places like this. As she walked toward the coffee shop, Sarah noticed something different about the atmosphere. Small groups of people stood on street corners, their voices hushed, but their body language tense. She had learned to read situations quickly during her military career, and something was clearly troubling the residents of Millbrook. Inside Morning Brew, Emma looked nervous as she prepared Sarah's usual order. Her hands shook slightly as she operated the espresso machine, and she kept glancing toward the window with worried eyes. "Everything okay, Emma?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice gentle and non-threatening. She had learned that civilians often responded better to kindness than direct questioning. Emma hesitated, then leaned closer across the counter. "There's been some trouble in town lately. A group of men moved in about 2 weeks ago. They're causing problems for local businesses, demanding protection money, and threatening people who don't comply." Sarah's trained instincts immediately kicked in, though she kept her expression neutral. "Have you called the police?" "Sheriff Martinez is doing what he can, but there are only 3 officers in the whole department. These guys seem to have connections, and they're careful about when and how they operate. They never do anything when the police are around." As if summoned by their conversation, the coffee shop door opened with such force that the small bell above it clanged violently. 3 men entered, and Sarah immediately cataloged their appearance and potential threat level. The leader was tall and broad-shouldered, with sleeve tattoos covering both arms and a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. His companions were smaller, but carried themselves with the swagger of men who were used to intimidating others. Emma stepped back from the counter, her face pale. The normal chatter of the coffee shop's other patrons died completely, leaving only the hum of the espresso machine and the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. Well, the leader said, his voice carrying a tone that made Sarah's jaw tighten. "Looks like business is good this morning, Emma. That's good news for us." Sarah remained seated at her table by the window, but every muscle in her body was ready for action. She had faced down terrorists in caves and pirates on the high seas, but watching innocent civilians being terrorized in their own community triggered something primal in her. "I told you yesterday, Marcus, I can't afford what you're asking," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The shop barely makes enough to cover expenses." Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "That's not my problem, sweetheart. Protection costs money. You want to keep serving coffee in this pretty little shop, you pay the fee. It's simple business." One of his companions, a man with a shaved head and multiple facial piercings, walked over to the display case and deliberately knocked over a stack of coffee mugs. The ceramic shattered on the floor, causing several customers to gasp and one elderly woman to clutch her chest. "Oops," he said with a grin. "Accidents happen when businesses don't have proper protection." Sarah watched Emma's shoulders shake as she fought back tears. The young woman reached under the counter, probably for a towel to clean up the mess, but Sarah could see her hands trembling. This was exactly the kind of situation that had driven Sarah to serve her country in the first place. Good people being hurt by those who thought strength meant preying on the vulnerable. "You have until tomorrow morning to come up with $500, Marcus continued, leaning across the counter in a way that invaded Emma's personal space. "And the price goes up every day you're late." Sarah made a decision. She stood up slowly, taking care not to make any sudden movements that might escalate the situation unnecessarily. Years of tactical training had taught her that the best interventions often started quietly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but carrying enough authority to make all 3 men turn in her direction. "I think you gentlemen might want to reconsider your business model." Marcus looked her up and down, taking in her average height, shoulder-length brown hair, and simple jeans and sweater. To him, she probably looked like just another small-town woman who could be easily intimidated. "Lady, this doesn't concern you," he said, his tone dismissive. Why don't you finish your coffee and mind your own business? Sarah stepped closer, and those with military experience would have recognized the fluid, controlled way she moved. But Marcus and his friend saw only a woman who appeared to be in her early 40s, someone they assumed would back down at the first sign of aggression. Actually, it does concern me, Sarah said evenly. I live in this community now, and I don't like seeing good people being threatened. The man with facial piercings laughed. You live here? What are you new in town? Because if you stick around, you'll learn that everyone pays their fair share for protection, including you. Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always descended on her before combat operations. Her heart rate remained steady, her breathing controlled. She had been in situations where the wrong move could mean death, and this encounter, while serious, was manageable. I am new in town, she confirmed, and I'm still learning about local customs. But where I come from, we have a different way of handling bullies. Marcus stepped closer to her, trying to use his height advantage for intimidation. Is that so? And where exactly did you come from, lady? Different places, Sarah replied, not backing away despite his proximity. I've traveled quite a bit for work. The third man, who had been silent until now, moved to flank Sarah's left side. They were positioning themselves tactically, though their technique was amateur compared to what Sarah was accustomed to facing. What kind of work? Marcus pressed, apparently thinking he could intimidate her into revealing personal information that might make her vulnerable. Sarah glanced around the coffee shop. The other customers had pressed themselves against the walls, some looking toward the exit. Emma stood frozen behind the counter, clearly terrified that the situation was escalating because of Sarah's intervention. Customer service, Sarah said with a slight smile. I specialized in handling difficult people who thought they were tougher than they actually were. Marcus's face darkened. You've got a smart mouth. Maybe we need to teach you some manners along with the coffee girl here. Sarah's military training included extensive psychological profiling, and she could read Marcus like a manual. He was a bully who had probably never faced serious opposition, someone who relied on intimidation and the threat of violence rather than actual fighting skill. His companions were followers, dangerous in a group, but unlikely to act independently. I don't think that would be wise, Sarah said quietly. For several reasons. Really? Marcus reached into his jacket, and Sarah's training kicked into high gear. Her eyes tracked his movement, noting the bulge that suggested a weapon, but also analyzing his body language to determine his intent. Give me one good reason why we shouldn't make an example out of you right here and now. Sarah's voice remained steady and calm, but there was something new in her tone, a hint of steel that hadn't been there before. Because you have no idea who you're dealing with. The man with piercings laughed nervously. What's that supposed to mean? You think you're some kind of tough guy because you watch action movies? Sarah looked directly at Marcus, her eyes never wavering. I think you should take your friends and leave this establishment. Now, before you find out exactly what kind of customer service training I received. For a moment, the coffee shop was completely silent except for the soft jazz playing from the speakers. Marcus studied Sarah's face, probably looking for signs of fear or uncertainty. What he saw instead was the steady gaze of someone who had looked death in the face and emerged victorious. But Marcus had built his reputation on never backing down, especially not in front of witnesses. His pride wouldn't allow him to be challenged by a woman in civilian clothes, no matter how steady her voice or confident her posture. You know what, lady? I think you need to learn about respect. He turned to his companions. Boys, I think our new friend here needs a lesson in how things work in Millbrook. Sarah sighed softly. She had hoped to resolve this without violence, but some people only understood strength. She began calculating distances, exit routes, and potential weapons in the immediate environment. The coffee shop had several advantages: limited space that would prevent the men from surrounding her effectively, furniture that could be used defensively, and multiple witnesses who could testify about who started the confrontation. Last chance, she said quietly. Walk away. Marcus pulled out a switchblade, the metal gleaming under the coffee shop's warm lighting. I don't think so. Time for you to learn some respect. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her stance. Years of combat training took over, and she became someone else entirely. Not the quiet woman who ordered the same coffee every morning, but the warrior who had spent 8 years as one of the most elite soldiers in the world. Gentlemen, she said, her voice now carrying unmistakable authority. You have just made a very serious mistake. Emma gasped from behind the counter as she watched the transformation. The woman she served coffee to every morning suddenly stood differently, moved differently, even breathed differently. There was nothing subtle about the change. It was as if Sarah had removed a carefully maintained disguise. Marcus hesitated for the first time, sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic. But he was committed now, and backing down would mean losing face in front of his crew and the witnesses in the coffee shop. Big words from someone about to learn a hard lesson, he said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Sarah smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. You're right. Someone is about to learn a lesson. But it's not going to be me. The man with piercings moved first, lunging towards Sarah from her left side. What happened next would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come, though most people would have trouble believing the reports even from witnesses they trusted. Sarah moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone who appeared to be an ordinary citizen. She stepped inside the pierced man's attack, grabbed his wrist, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into a nearby table. Coffee cups and pastries went flying as he hit the wooden surface and rolled onto the floor, groaning. The third man hesitated, clearly shocked by how quickly his companion had been neutralized. Marcus raised his knife, but Sarah was already moving toward him with the fluid grace of someone who had trained for thousands of hours in hand-to-hand combat. She caught Marcus's knife hand in a grip that made him cry out in pain, applied pressure to specific nerve points that forced his fingers to open, and sent the blade skittering across the floor. Before he could react, she had spun him around and applied a chokehold that rendered him unconscious in seconds. As Marcus slumped to the floor, the third man decided that discretion was the better part of valor. He looked at his unconscious leader, his groaning companion struggling to get up from the floor, and at Sarah standing calmly in the middle of the coffee shop without even breathing heavily. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward the door. Sarah looked at him with the same steady gaze that had unnerved Marcus. "Yes, it is. And if you're smart, you'll make sure your friends understand that when they wake up." The man fled through the door, leaving behind his companions and what remained of their reputation for invincibility. Sarah looked around the coffee shop at the stunned faces of the other customers. Emma stood behind the counter with her mouth open, clearly trying to process what she had just witnessed. "Someone should call Sheriff Martinez," Sarah said calmly, as if she hadn't just single-handedly neutralized two grown men in less than 30 seconds. "These gentlemen will need medical attention, and there are some legal matters to sort out." An elderly man who had been sitting in the corner fumbled for his cell phone. "I'll call right now." "Miss, that was incredible." Sarah shrugged. "It was necessary." Emma found her voice. "Sarah, I had no idea you could. What kind of customer service did you say you did?" Sarah smiled, and this time it was warm and genuine. The kind where customer satisfaction was literally a matter of life and death. As they waited for Sheriff Martinez to arrive, Sarah helped Emma clean up the broken mugs and overturned furniture. The other customers gradually returned to their seats, though their conversations were hushed and filled with amazement at what they had witnessed. Marcus began to stir, groaning as consciousness returned. Sarah knelt beside him, her voice quiet but firm. "When you wake up fully, you're going to listen very carefully. Your protection racket in Millbrook is finished. You and your friends are going to leave town and find honest work somewhere else." Marcus opened his eyes, confused and disoriented. When he saw Sarah's face above him, memory flooded back, along with fear. "Who are you?" he whispered. Sarah considered her answer carefully. She had spent 3 months building a quiet life in Millbrook, hoping to leave her military identity behind. But sometimes the past had a way of demanding recognition, especially when innocent people needed protection. "Someone who spent 20 years learning how to deal with people like you," she said simply. Sheriff Martinez arrived 10 minutes later with both of his officers in tow. He was a stocky man in his 50s who had clearly seen his share of trouble, but his eyes widened as he took in the scene. 2 men on the floor, one still unconscious, and the other holding his ribs, surrounded by witnesses who all seemed to be looking at one ordinary-looking woman with something approaching awe. "What happened here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already had a pretty good idea. Emma launched into a rapid explanation, with other customers adding details. Sheriff Martinez listened carefully, his eyes frequently returning to Sarah, who stood quietly by the window where she had been sitting when the trouble started. When the witnesses had finished their accounts, Sheriff Martinez approached Sarah. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to get your statement. But first, I have to ask, are you injured?" "No, Sheriff. I'm fine." "And you subdued both of these men by yourself?" "They subdued themselves." I just provided a little guidance. Sheriff Martinez had been in law enforcement for 27 years, and he had learned to recognize certain types of people. There was something about Sarah's calm demeanor, her precise way of speaking, and the way she carried herself that reminded him of military personnel he had known. "Ma'am, can I ask what your background is?" Sarah hesitated. She had hoped to avoid this conversation for much longer, but circumstances had forced her hand. "I'm retired military, Sheriff." "What branch?" "Navy." "What was your specialty?" Sarah looked around the coffee shop at the faces watching her expectantly. These were good people who deserved to feel safe in their own community. They had shown kindness to a stranger, and now they were looking at her with curiosity rather than fear, despite what they had just witnessed. "Special operations," she said simply. Sheriff Martinez nodded slowly. A lot of pieces were falling into place. "Ma'am, would you be willing to come down to the station to give a full statement? And maybe we could have a conversation about the situation in Millbrook?" Sarah looked at Emma, who was watching her with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. She looked at the other customers, decent people who just wanted to drink their coffee in peace without fear of intimidation. She had come to Millbrook seeking quiet anonymity, but perhaps her skills were needed here after all. "Yes, Sheriff. I think that would be a good idea." As the paramedics arrived to check on Marcus and his companion, Sarah reflected on how quickly her carefully constructed civilian life had been disrupted. But as she watched Emma smile for the first time since the man had entered the coffee shop, she realized that some disruptions were worth it. The news of what had happened at Morning Brew spread through Millbrook with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By evening, everyone in town had heard some version of the story about the quiet woman who had single-handedly taken down 2 members of the protection racket that had been terrorizing local businesses. Sarah spent 2 hours at the sheriff's station, providing a detailed statement and answering questions about her background. Sheriff Martinez was professional and respectful, but she could see the curiosity in his eyes. It wasn't every day that a retired Navy SEAL moved to a town of fewer than 8,000 people. "Ms. Mitchell," Sheriff Martinez said as they concluded their interview, "I have to ask, what brought you to Millbrook?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "I spent 20 years serving my country in various capacities. When I retired, I wanted to find a quiet place where I could live peacefully and maybe contribute to a community in a more normal way." "Well, you certainly contributed today. Marcus Webb and his crew have been a problem for weeks. We've been building a case, but they've been careful about witnesses and evidence. What you did today might be exactly what we needed to shut them down permanently. I hope so. People like Emma shouldn't have to live in fear." Sheriff Martinez leaned back in his chair. "Can I ask you something off the record?" Sarah nodded. "How many people like Marcus have you dealt with in your career?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Sheriff, in 20 years of military service, including operations in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, I learned that bullies are essentially the same everywhere. They rely on fear and intimidation because they've never had to face someone who wasn't afraid of them." "And you weren't afraid?" "I was trained not to be." As Sarah prepared to leave the station, Sheriff Martinez made an unexpected request. "Ms. Mitchell, I know you came here looking for a quiet life, and I respect that. But I wonder if you might consider helping us with a community safety program? Nothing official, but maybe some self-defense classes or consultation on security matters." Sarah paused at the door. "Let me think about it, Sheriff." That evening, Sarah sat on her back porch, looking out at the woods that bordered her small rental house. She had chosen this place specifically because it was peaceful, isolated enough that she could decompress from years of high-stress military operations. The last thing she had wanted was to get involved in local conflicts or draw attention to her background. But as she replayed the day's events, she found herself thinking about Emma's frightened face and the relief in her eyes after Marcus had been neutralized. She thought about the elderly couple who had been sitting in the corner of the coffee shop, clearly terrified but with nowhere else to go for their morning routine. She thought about all the small business owners in Millbrook who had been paying protection money to avoid trouble. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID and smiled. It was her former teammate Jake Rodriguez, who had retired from the SEALs 2 years earlier and now worked as a security consultant in San Diego. "Jake, what's up?" "Sarah, I just got a call from a buddy of mine in law enforcement. Apparently, there's a video making the rounds of some woman taking down 2 thugs in a coffee shop, and someone thought the woman looked familiar." Sarah groaned. "Please tell me there's not actually a video." "Oh, there's definitely a video. One of the customers was recording when it started, probably for evidence in case things went bad. But here's the thing. You can't really see your face clearly, and your name isn't mentioned. Most people are just calling you the mystery woman. Great. So much for keeping a low profile. Jake laughed. Sarah, you knew this day would come. You can't spend 8 years as a SEAL and then just disappear into civilian life without occasionally having to use your training. I was hoping I could. Look, I watched the video. You showed remarkable restraint. You could have seriously hurt those guys, but you neutralized them with minimal force and no permanent damage. That's exactly how we were trained to handle civilian situations. Sarah sighed. I know, but I moved here to get away from all of this. Maybe the universe has other plans. Maybe Millbrook needs you. After hanging up with Jake, Sarah found herself thinking about his words. She had always believed that her military service was about protecting innocent people and communities like Millbrook. Perhaps retirement didn't mean abandoning that mission entirely. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into her driveway. Through the window, she saw Emma getting out of a small blue sedan, carrying what looked like a covered dish. Sarah opened the front door before Emma could knock. Emma, you didn't need to come all the way out here. Yes, I did, Emma said firmly. You saved my business today, maybe my life. The least I can do is bring you dinner. They sat at Sarah's kitchen table, sharing the homemade lasagna that Emma had prepared. As they ate, Emma asked the questions that Sarah had been expecting. Sarah, what you did today? I've never seen anything like it. You moved like someone from an action movie, but it was real. It was real, Sarah confirmed. And it was necessary. Were you really in the Navy? Yes. What did you do in the Navy? Sarah considered how much to reveal. Emma deserved some explanation, but operational security was still important, even in retirement. I was part of a special operations unit. We specialized in high-risk missions, often involving the protection of civilians or the neutralization of threats to American interests. Emma's eyes widened. Like Navy SEALs? Sarah smiled. Something like that. And you came to Millbrook to retire? I came to Millbrook to find peace, to live a quiet life, and maybe figure out who I am when I'm not in uniform. Emma leaned forward. Sarah, I have to ask, are there more people like Marcus out there? People who might come looking for revenge? Sarah had been wondering the same thing. Marcus and his crew were small-time operators, but they might have connections to larger criminal organizations. Her intervention today might have prevented immediate harm, but it could also have drawn unwanted attention. I don't know, Sarah admitted. But I'll be keeping an eye on the situation. What if they come back with more people? What if they have weapons? Sarah met Emma's worried gaze. Emma, I want you to know something. I came to Millbrook to retire from military service, but I didn't retire from protecting people who need help. If Marcus or anyone like him threatens you or this community again, they'll have to deal with me. But you're just one person. Sarah smiled. You'd be surprised what one person with the right training can accomplish. As Emma prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. After what happened today, word is spreading around town about who you might be. People are curious, but they're also grateful. And they're talking about what this might mean for Millbrook. What do you mean? I mean that for the first time in weeks, I'm not afraid to open my shop tomorrow morning. And neither are the other business owners who've been dealing with Marcus and his crew. You gave us something we hadn't had in a long time, hope. After Emma left, Sarah stood on her porch again, looking out at the quiet town lights in the distance. She had come to Millbrook seeking anonymity and peace, but perhaps she had found something else entirely, a place where her skills could make a real difference in people's daily lives. As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a mental note to call Sheriff Martinez in the morning. If Marcus had connections to larger criminal organizations, they needed to be prepared for possible retaliation. And if other communities were dealing with similar problems, perhaps it was time to consider a more active role in addressing them. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Sarah found herself thinking not about escaping her military identity, but about how to use it constructively in civilian life. The quiet woman who ordered the same coffee every morning was gone, but perhaps the person who remained could do even more good in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, the people of Millbrook could sleep a little easier knowing that someone was watching over them, who had spent years learning how to keep good people safe from those who would do them harm. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook as Sarah made her way to morning brew, 3 days after the confrontation that had changed everything. She had spent those days fielding phone calls from Sheriff Martinez, declining interview requests from regional newspapers, and trying to maintain some semblance of the quiet routine she had established. But as she approached the coffee shop, she could see that normal was no longer an option. A small crowd had gathered outside Morning Brew, and Sarah recognized several faces from that morning 3 days ago. There was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had clutched her chest when the coffee mug shattered. Mr. Garcia, who owned the hardware store 2 blocks down. Janet Mills, who ran the local bakery. They were all talking in hushed, excited tones, and when they saw Sarah approaching, the conversation stopped entirely. "There she is," someone whispered, though not quietly enough. Sarah nodded politely to the group and made her way inside, where she found Emma behind the counter with a smile that was equal parts gratitude and nervousness. "The usual?" Emma asked, though her voice carried an undertone that suggested this morning would be anything but usual. "Please," Sarah replied, taking her customary seat by the window. She noticed that the broken mugs had been replaced, and someone had installed a small security camera above the entrance. Smart move. As Emma prepared her coffee, Sheriff Martinez entered the shop. He looked tired, and Sarah suspected he hadn't been sleeping well since the incident. He approached her table with the careful steps of a man who had something important to discuss, but wasn't sure how to begin. "Ms. Mitchell, could I have a word?" Sarah gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Of course, Sheriff." Martinez sat down and placed a manila folder on the table. "I've been doing some research into Marcus Webb and his associates. What I found isn't good news." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "What did you discover?" "Webb isn't just some local thug looking to make quick money. He's got connections to a larger organization operating throughout the region. They call themselves the Iron Brotherhood, and they've been expanding their territory systematically, targeting small towns with limited law enforcement resources." Sarah felt a familiar chill run down her spine. Organized criminal expansion was something she had dealt with in various forms during her military career, though usually in foreign countries. The tactics were always similar: identify vulnerable communities, establish fear through intimidation, then build a network of illegal enterprises protected by that fear. "How large an organization are we talking about?" she asked. "Best estimates suggest maybe 50 to 70 active members spread across 6 counties. They're involved in everything from protection rackets like what we saw here, to drug distribution, illegal gambling, and human trafficking." Sarah's jaw tightened at the last item. Human trafficking was something that triggered her deepest protective instincts, dating back to a rescue mission in Southeast Asia that had shown her the worst of what humans could do to each other. And Marcus was part of this larger network. A small part, but yes. According to my contacts in the state police, the Iron Brotherhood doesn't take kindly to having their operations disrupted. What you did 3 days ago sent a message that someone in Millbrook isn't afraid of them. Sarah understood the implication. So they'll be back. That's what I'm afraid of. And next time, they won't send 3 amateurs with switchblades. Emma appeared at their table with Sarah's coffee and a worried expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you saying that what happened the other day might bring more trouble?" Sheriff Martinez looked at Sarah, clearly deferring to her expertise in these matters. Sarah considered her words carefully. These people deserve the truth, but she didn't want to create panic. "Emma, the men who were threatening you were part of a larger criminal organization. When that organization learns what happened to their people, they'll likely view it as a challenge that needs to be answered." "What does that mean for the rest of us?" Emma asked, her voice small. Sarah looked around the coffee shop. The morning crowd was going about their business, but she could sense an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there a week ago. Word was spreading, and people were starting to understand that the confrontation 3 days ago might have been just the beginning. "It means we need to be prepared," Sarah said simply. Sheriff Martinez opened his folder and spread several photographs on the table. "These are the key players in the Iron Brotherhood. The man at the top is Vince Corallo. He's got a record going back 20 years, including assault, extortion, and suspected involvement in 2 unsolved murders." Sarah studied the photograph. Corallo was a heavy-set man in his 50s with cold eyes and the kind of face that suggested he had never backed down from a fight in his life. This wasn't someone who would let the humiliation of his subordinates go unanswered. "What kind of response are you expecting?" she asked. "Based on their pattern in other towns, they'll probably start with escalated intimidation. More people, better weapons, targeting multiple businesses simultaneously to spread fear. If that doesn't work, they move to actual violence." Sarah felt the familiar calm that always preceded tactical planning. "What resources do you have available?" 3 full-time officers, including myself, 2 part-time deputies, and whatever support the state police can provide when they're not busy with larger cities. Sarah did the math quickly. Against an organization of 50 to 70 experienced criminals, Millbrook's law enforcement was vastly outnumbered. In military terms, they were facing an insurgency with insufficient resources to maintain security. Sheriff, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Martinez nodded. If this situation escalates beyond what your department can handle, what options do you have? Martinez was quiet for a long moment. Officially, we call in the state police and hope they can spare enough resources to help us. Unofficially, we hope that someone with your particular skill set might be willing to help protect this community. Sarah leaned back in her chair. She had known this moment would come, had sensed it the instant she decided to intervene 3 days ago. Her quiet retirement in Millbrook was over, but perhaps it had been an illusion anyway. Sheriff, what do you know about my background? Specifically, I made some calls after our interview. I spoke with a contact I have in the Defense Department. He couldn't give me details, but he did say that if you were willing to help with the security situation, I should consider myself very fortunate. Sarah smiled slightly. What else did he tell you? He said that in 8 years as a Navy SEAL, you participated in over 40 successful missions, that you were decorated for valor multiple times, and that you left service with the highest possible recommendations from your commanding officers. And he said that if the Iron Brotherhood was smart, they'd find another town to terrorize. Emma had been listening to this conversation with growing amazement. Sarah, you're actually a Navy SEAL? Like a real one. Former Navy SEAL, Sarah corrected. But yes, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell anyone when you moved here? Sarah looked out the window at the quiet street, where people were going about their morning routines. Because I came here to be Sarah Mitchell, retired civilian. I didn't want to be Sarah Mitchell, former special operations warrior. I wanted to blend in, live quietly, maybe teach some part-time classes at the community college. Sheriff Martinez leaned forward. But you're willing to help now? Sarah was quiet for several minutes, watching the people of Millbrook through the window. She saw Mrs. Henderson walking her small dog, Mr. Garcia unlocking his hardware store, children waiting for the school bus. These were good people living honest lives, and they didn't deserve to live in fear because she had disrupted a criminal operation. Sheriff, I need to know something first. Are you asking me to help as a private citizen, or are you offering me some kind of official position? What would you prefer? Sarah considered the question carefully. Operating as a private citizen gave her more flexibility, but less legal protection. An official position would provide authority, but also bureaucratic constraints. I think the most effective approach would be to make me a special consultant to your department. Someone with expertise in dealing with organized criminal threats. Done, Martinez said immediately. What do you need? First, I need to know everything you have on the Iron Brotherhood's operations, leadership structure, and typical response patterns. Second, I need to assess Millbrook's defensive capabilities and identify vulnerabilities. Third, I need to know which members of this community might be willing and able to help protect it. Emma raised her hand tentatively. What about people like me? People who aren't trained for this kind of thing but want to help. Sarah smiled warmly. Emma, there are many ways to help that don't involve direct confrontation. Communication networks, safe houses, supply coordination, intelligence gathering. Every successful defensive operation depends as much on civilian support as it does on trained fighters. Sheriff Martinez gathered his photographs. When do we start? We started 3 days ago when I decided not to walk away from trouble. Now we just make it official. As if summoned by their conversation, the coffee shop door opened, and Jake Rodriguez walked in. Sarah's former teammate looked around the shop with the automatic threat assessment that all SEALs developed, taking in exit routes, potential cover, and the positioning of civilians. Jake! Sarah stood up, genuinely surprised. What are you doing here? I told you that video was making the rounds. When I heard through the network that you might be dealing with organized crime, I figured you could use some backup. Sheriff Martinez looked between Sarah and Jake. Friend of yours? Former teammate, Sarah explained. Jake Rodriguez, meet Sheriff Martinez and Emma Williams. Sheriff, Jake was my swim buddy during SEAL training and served with me on 3 deployments. Jake shook hands with both of them. I've been following the situation through some contacts. The Iron Brotherhood is bad news, Sarah. They've been expanding aggressively, and they don't like setbacks. That's what we were just discussing. How much do you know about their current operations? Jake sat down at their table. More than you might think. I've been doing security consulting for some businesses they've targeted. The pattern is always the same. They identify communities with limited law enforcement, establish a foothold through intimidation, then gradually expand their control until they essentially own the local economy. What's their typical response to resistance? Sheriff Martinez asked. Overwhelming force designed to make an example. They'll bring in 15 to 20 people, hit multiple targets simultaneously, and escalate violence until the resistance breaks. Sarah felt her tactical mind engaging fully. Timeline. Usually within a week of the initial provocation. They like to respond quickly while the community is still processing what happened. Emma looked pale. 15 to 20 people? Coming here. Possibly, Sarah said honestly. But that also creates opportunities. Large groups are harder to coordinate, easier to track, and more vulnerable to the kind of tactics that work against organized criminals. Jake grinned. I was hoping you'd say that, because I may have brought some additional resources. What kind of resources? 2 more former SEALs who happen to be between consulting jobs and were looking for something meaningful to do with their time, plus some equipment that might prove useful if this situation escalates. Sarah felt a familiar surge of confidence that came from having trusted teammates to rely on. They're here, staying at the motel on the highway. Dave Chun and Maria Santos. You remember them? Sarah did remember them. Dave Chun had been their demolitions expert, a quiet man with an engineering degree who could make explosives out of household items or disable them with equal skill. Maria Santos had been their sniper and reconnaissance specialist, capable of hitting targets at distances that seemed impossible. Sheriff Martinez looked overwhelmed. You're telling me that 4 Navy SEALs are now in Millbrook? Former Navy SEALs, Jake corrected. But yes. And you're all willing to help protect this community? Sarah looked around the coffee shop, then at Jake, Sheriff Martinez, and Emma. Sheriff, Emma, I need you both to understand something. If we do this, if we decide to take a stand against the Iron Brotherhood, there's no going back. Once we commit to protecting Millbrook, we see it through to the end. What does that mean exactly? Emma asked. It means that instead of 3 amateurs with switchblades, this community will be defended by people who spent years learning how to neutralize serious threats. It means that any criminals who come here looking for easy targets will find something very different than what they expected. Sheriff Martinez was quiet for a moment. Ms. Mitchell, I have to ask, are you talking about lethal force? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Sheriff, I'm talking about whatever force is necessary to protect innocent people. Hopefully, that will be minimal. But if the Iron Brotherhood escalates to violence against civilians, they'll discover that Millbrook is defended by people who are very good at their jobs. Jake nodded. We operate within the law, but we operate effectively. The goal is always to neutralize threats with the minimum necessary force. But we don't lose. Emma was looking back and forth between them. This is really happening, isn't it? My quiet little town is about to become some kind of battleground. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand on Emma's. Emma, your quiet little town was already under attack. We're just making sure the right side wins. Sheriff Martinez made his decision. What do you need from me to make this work? Legal authority to operate, access to intelligence about the Iron Brotherhood's plans, and coordination with state law enforcement when appropriate. Can you provide those things? Yes. What else? Sarah looked at Jake. We need to conduct a security assessment of Millbrook, identify defensive positions, establish communication protocols, and begin training community members in basic security procedures. How long do we have? Probably 72 hours before the Iron Brotherhood responds. Maybe less. Sheriff Martinez stood up. Then, we'd better get started. As the sheriff left to make official arrangements, Sarah turned to Emma. I know this is overwhelming, but I need to ask you something important. What? Are you willing to coordinate civilian support for this operation? We'll need safe houses, communication networks, supply coordination, and intelligence gathering from community members. It's not dangerous work, but it's essential. Emma was quiet for a moment, then squared her shoulders. 3 days ago, I was terrified to open my coffee shop because some thugs wanted protection money. Now you're asking me to help coordinate the defense of my entire town. Yes. You know what? Yes. I'm in. These people threaten my livelihood, my safety, and my community. If you can stop them, then I'll do whatever I can to help. Sarah smiled. Good. Jake, let's go meet with Dave and Maria. We have a lot of work to do in very little time. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Mrs. Henderson approached their table. The elderly woman who had been terrified 3 days ago now had a determined expression on her face. Excuse me, dear, she said to Sarah. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Are you really going to protect our town from these criminals? We're going to do our best, Mrs. Henderson. Well then, I want you to know that my late husband was a sergeant in the Korean War. and he taught me a few things about supporting military operations. If you need a place for meetings or somewhere to coordinate activities, my house is available." Sarah was touched by the offer. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. We might take you up on that." As they left Morning Brew, Sarah reflected on how quickly things had changed. 3 days ago, she had been trying to disappear into civilian life. Now she was preparing to defend an entire community against organized criminals, with the help of her former teammates and the support of people she was only beginning to know. But as she looked at the peaceful streets of Millbrook, with children playing in yards and people going about their daily routines, she realized that this was exactly the kind of mission she had always trained for, protecting good people from those who would harm them. The Iron Brotherhood was about to learn that they had chosen the wrong town to terrorize. Millbrook might look like an easy target, but appearances could be very deceiving. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Millbrook had been empty for 3 years, but in the span of 18 hours, it had been transformed into something that would have made any military commander proud. Sarah stood in the center of the main floor, watching as Dave Chun made final adjustments to the communication equipment he had somehow acquired overnight. Maria Santos was positioned in the building's highest window, adjusting the scope on a rifle that definitely wasn't standard civilian hunting gear. "Comms check," Dave said into his headset, his voice carrying the calm professionalism that Sarah remembered from dozens of operations. "Sarah, Jake, Maria, Sheriff Martinez, come in." "Sarah here, 5x5, she responded. "Jake, good signal." "Maria here, visual on all approach routes." "Sheriff Martinez, loud and clear." Sheriff Martinez emerged from behind a stack of equipment crates, shaking his head in amazement. "I have to admit, when you said you needed 18 hours to set up defensive positions, I didn't expect this level of sophistication." Sarah smiled. "Old habits die hard. Plus, Dave has a talent for acquiring useful equipment on short notice." "I prefer to think of it as advanced logistics management," Dave said without looking up from his equipment. "Everything we're using is either legally purchased or on loan from contacts who understand the situation." The warehouse had been divided into several functional areas. The main floor served as a command center, with computers, communication equipment, and detailed maps of Millbrook and the surrounding area. A smaller room had been converted into a briefing area where community volunteers could receive training in basic security procedures. The upper level provided observation posts with clear sight lines to all major approach routes to the town. Jake approached Sarah with a tablet displaying surveillance footage. "We've got eyes on all the main roads, plus motion sensors on the 3 dirt tracks that could be used for covert approach. If the Iron Brotherhood comes to Millbrook, we'll know about it long before they reach the town center." "What about escape routes for civilians?" Sarah asked. "We've identified 4 primary evacuation routes that lead away from the town center toward the state highway. Emma and her volunteers have prepared rally points with supplies and communication equipment. If things go bad, we can have the most vulnerable residents out of harm's way in under 20 minutes. Sheriff Martinez studied the maps spread across one of the tables. "I've been sheriff here for 12 years, and I never realized how defensible this town actually is if you know what you're doing." Sarah nodded. "Most small towns have natural defensive advantages, but they've never been analyzed from a tactical perspective. Millbrook has several choke points where small groups can control access, multiple elevated positions for observation, and enough back roads to allow for rapid repositioning." Maria's voice came through the communication system. "Vehicle approaching from the north. Single occupant, driving slowly like they're surveying the area." Sarah moved to the window and raised her binoculars. A black sedan was creeping along Main Street, the driver's head turning from side to side as he took in the layout of the town. This wasn't a lost tourist or someone looking for a business address. "Jake, get ready to track that vehicle." "Dave, start recording everything." "Already on it," Dave replied. "Facial recognition software is running, and I'm capturing license plate data." The sedan made a complete circuit of the town center, stopping briefly in front of Morning Brew, the hardware store, and the sheriff's office. The driver appeared to be taking photographs or video with a cell phone. "Classic reconnaissance pattern," Jake observed. "They're mapping targets and escape routes." Sheriff Martinez spoke into his radio. "All units, we have a suspicious vehicle conducting surveillance. Black sedan, license plate Charlie 79 Alpha Delta Mike. Do not approach, just monitor and report." The sedan completed its survey and headed back toward the highway, but not before the driver made a phone call that lasted several minutes. "Well," Sarah said, lowering her binoculars. I think it's safe to assume the Iron Brotherhood knows what happened to Marcus and his crew. Maria's voice came through the speakers again. Sarah, you need to see this. I've got movement on the eastern approach road. Multiple vehicles. Sarah quickly climbed to Maria's position in the upper level. Through the powerful scope, she could see a convoy of 3 vehicles moving slowly along the road that led to Millbrook from the county highway. They had stopped about 2 miles out, just beyond the range of casual observation from the town. Count, Sarah asked. First vehicle looks like an SUV with 4 occupants. Second is a van, probably 6 to 8 people. Third SUV, another 4 or 5. Call it 15 people minimum. Sarah felt the familiar pre-battle clarity that had served her well in hostile environments around the world. Jake, Dave, get up here. Sheriff, you need to see this. Within minutes, all 4 of them were crowded around Maria's observation post, taking turns with the scope and binoculars. They're setting up a staging area, Jake observed. Classic tactical position. Far enough out to avoid detection, close enough for rapid deployment. Sheriff Martinez looked grim. 15 people is more than my entire department can handle, especially if they're armed and organized. Good thing you've got backup, Sarah said. Dave, what's our communication status with the community volunteers? All primary coordinators are online and standing by. Emma's at the coffee shop coordinating with local business owners. Mrs. Henderson is managing the civilian evacuation network, and we've got spotters positioned at 6 key observation points throughout the town. Sarah made a decision. All right, here's what we're going to do. Sheriff, I need you to coordinate with state police, but don't request immediate backup yet. We want to control the timing of this confrontation. What do you mean? If the Iron Brotherhood thinks they're facing only local law enforcement, they'll be overconfident and sloppy. If they see state police cars, they might withdraw and try a different approach later, when we're less prepared. Jake nodded approvingly. Let them come to us on our terms, in a place where we have every advantage. But what if they don't come into town? Sheriff Martinez asked. What if they just send more surveillance, or wait us out? Sarah smiled grimly. Then, we go to them. But I'm betting they won't wait. The Iron Brotherhood's reputation depends on swift, overwhelming responses to challenges. The longer they wait, the more they look weak to their other territories. Maria, still watching through her scope, reported new activity. They're moving. All 3 vehicles, heading toward town. Showtime, Jake said quietly. Sarah activated the communication system. All stations, this is base command. We have 15 hostile approaching from the east. Estimated time to downtown area, 8 minutes. All civilians to evacuation positions immediately. All spotters report in. The responses came quickly. Spotter 1, north entrance clear. Spotter 2, west side quiet. Spotter 3, south approach all clear. Emma here, all business owners notified and moving to safe positions. Mrs. Henderson reporting, evacuation routes active and ready. Sarah felt a surge of pride in how quickly the community had organized itself. Sheriff, where do you want to position yourself? I'll be in my patrol car at the main intersection. If we're doing this legally, I need to attempt to make contact first. Understood. But, Sheriff, if shooting starts, you get to cover immediately. Leave the tactical response to us. Sheriff Martinez nodded grimly and headed down to his vehicle. Sarah turned to her team. Deployment positions. Jake, you take the hardware store rooftop. Overlooks the main intersection. Dave, community center, good sight lines, and multiple exit routes. Maria, you stay here with overwatch and coordination. I'll be mobile, responding to wherever the main threat develops. Rules of engagement? Jake asked. Minimum necessary force. But if they threaten civilians or use weapons, we respond in kind. Priority is protecting innocent people, not preserving criminal lives. As her team moved to their positions, Sarah reflected on how surreal this situation had become. 6 days ago, she had been a retired veteran trying to drink coffee in peace. Now she was coordinating the defense of an entire town against organized criminals. But, as she checked her weapon and communication equipment, she felt a familiar sense of purpose that had been missing from her civilian life. This was what she had trained for, what she was good at. The Iron Brotherhood was about to discover that their standard intimidation tactics wouldn't work in Millbrook. The 3 vehicles entered the town limits at exactly the speed limit, their occupants probably trying to appear casual despite their numbers. Sarah watched from her concealed position behind the post office as they drove slowly down Main Street, the same route the reconnaissance vehicle had taken earlier. The convoy stopped in front of Morning Brew, now closed and empty as planned. 8 men got out of the vehicles, all wearing dark clothing and moving with the casual arrogance of people who expected no serious opposition. Sarah recognized the type, street criminals who had probably never faced trained resistance. The apparent leader was a tall man with multiple visible tattoos and the kind of swagger that came from years of successful intimidation. He looked around the seemingly empty street with satisfaction, clearly believing that Millbrook had been sufficiently intimidated by their show of force. Sheriff Martinez's patrol car appeared at the intersection, and he parked directly across from the Iron Brotherhood convoy. Sarah watched as he got out of his car and approached the group, his hand resting casually near his weapon but not drawing it. "Gentlemen, I'm Sheriff Martinez. Can I ask what brings you to Millbrook today?" The tattooed leader laughed. "We're here on business, Sheriff. Seems like one of your local citizens has been interfering with our operations." "What kind of operations would those be?" "The kind where local businesses pay for protection services. We understand someone assaulted our employees and prevented them from conducting legitimate business." Sarah smiled grimly at the euphemisms. Through her earpiece, she heard Dave's voice. "I count 12 total hostiles. For staying with the vehicles, 8 in the conversation with the sheriff." "Copy," Sarah responded quietly. "Weapons visible. Bulges under jackets suggest handguns on at least 6 of them. One of the vehicle teams has what looks like a shotgun." Sheriff Martinez was maintaining his calm professionalism despite being outnumbered. "Sir, I investigated that incident. Your employees were threatening local business owners and attempted to assault a civilian. They were arrested for disturbing the peace and making threats." "Is that so?" The leader stepped closer to Sheriff Martinez, using height and proximity to intimidate. "Well, Sheriff, we're here to collect our employee and discuss some changes to how business is conducted in this town. Your associate was released on bail yesterday and left town. As for changes to local business practices, I'm afraid Millbrook operates under state and federal law, not protection rackets." The leader's expression hardened. "Maybe you don't understand the situation, Sheriff. My organization has operations in 6 counties. We've never had trouble with local law enforcement before, and we don't intend to start now." Sarah could see the tension escalating and knew that the situation was about to move beyond talking. She activated her communication system. "All positions, prepare for contact." Sheriff's signal will be stepping back from the conversation. Sheriff Martinez seemed to sense the same thing. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you and your people to leave town. If you have legitimate business here, you can conduct it during normal business hours through proper channels." The leader smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Sheriff, I don't think you understand. We're not leaving until we get satisfaction for what happened to our people. And we're going to make sure everyone in this town understands that interfering with our business has consequences." He gestured to his companions, and 2 of them started walking toward Morning Brew with obvious intent to force entry. Sheriff Martinez took a step back and spoke into his radio. "All units, we have a situation developing at Main and First." That was the signal Sarah had been waiting for. "All positions, hostiles are now engaging in criminal activity. We are authorized to respond." Sarah emerged from her concealment position, her weapon drawn but lowered. "Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from that business and return to your vehicles." The leader spun around, clearly startled by her appearance. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the person who had the conversation with Marcus and his friends. And you're the people who didn't get the message." The recognition was immediate. The leader's face shifted from confusion to anger to something approaching fear as he realized that the civilian who had humiliated his subordinates was now standing 20 feet away with a weapon and the backing of law enforcement. "You're the one," he said, his voice carrying a mix of rage and uncertainty. "I am. And you're trespassing on private property with intent to commit crimes. Last chance to leave peacefully." The leader looked around, noting the empty street and lack of visible backup for Sarah. His confidence began to return. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you're outnumbered 15-1. Maybe you got lucky with Marcus, but this is different." Sarah's voice remained calm and steady. "You're right. This is very different." At that moment, Jake appeared on the hardware store rooftop, clearly visible and obviously armed. Dave emerged from the community center entrance with equipment that definitely wasn't civilian hunting gear. Maria's voice came through speakers that the Iron Brotherhood couldn't see. "All hostile vehicles and personnel are covered. Any attempt to use weapons will result in immediate neutralization." The leader's confidence evaporated as he realized that he wasn't facing one woman and a small-town sheriff. He was looking at what was obviously a coordinated tactical response by people who knew exactly what they were doing. "What is this?" he demanded. "Who are you people?" Sarah smiled. "We're the people who protect Millbrook. And you're the people who just made a very serious mistake." The standoff lasted for several heartbeats, with both sides calculating odds and options. Sarah could see the leader's mind working, trying to figure out how a simple intimidation mission had turned into a tactical nightmare. Finally, he made his decision. "Boys, we're leaving. But this isn't over." "Yes, it is," Sarah said firmly. "Your protection racket in Millbrook is finished. Your people are no longer welcome in this town. And if you're smart, you'll spread the word that there are easier places to conduct your business." As the Iron Brotherhood members retreated to their vehicles, the leader made one final threat. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, lady. This organization doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive." Sarah's response was quiet, but carried clearly across the street. "Neither do I." The convoy departed Millbrook at considerably higher speed than they had arrived, leaving behind a town that had just discovered it was far from defenseless. As Sarah watched the vehicles disappear toward the highway, she knew that this confrontation was over, but the larger conflict was just beginning. The Iron Brotherhood would not accept this humiliation easily, and their next response would be much more serious than a simple intimidation visit. But as she looked around at her teammates and the community that had rallied to defend itself, Sarah felt confident that Millbrook was ready for whatever came next. 3 days had passed since the Iron Brotherhood's retreat from Millbrook, but Sarah knew better than to mistake their absence for surrender. She stood in the converted warehouse command center at 4 in the morning, studying intelligence reports that Dave had compiled from various sources. The picture they painted was troubling. "They're consolidating," Dave said, pointing to a map covered with colored pins representing known Iron Brotherhood activities. "Our contacts report unusual movement patterns across 3 counties. Vehicles, personnel, weapons, they're pulling resources from other operations." Maria looked up from her communication equipment. "I've been monitoring police scanner traffic across the region. 3 other towns have reported sudden decreases in Iron Brotherhood activity. Either they're pulling back from everywhere, or they're concentrating forces for something big." Jake entered the command center carrying coffee and a grim expression. "I just got off the phone with my contacts in federal law enforcement. The Iron Brotherhood isn't just a regional criminal organization. They've got connections to larger networks, including some groups with military experience." Sarah felt a familiar chill. Military experience meant disciplined tactics, proper equipment, and the kind of training that could neutralize the advantages she and her team currently held. What kind of military experience? Mixed bag. Some former military personnel who went bad after service, some foreign mercenaries, a few guys who got kicked out of various armed forces for disciplinary problems. Not elite units, but people who know how to handle weapons and follow tactical plans. Sheriff Martinez arrived looking like he hadn't slept in days, which was probably accurate. "I've got updates from state police intelligence. They're taking this situation seriously now, especially after I filed reports about the confrontation 3 days ago." "What kind of support can they provide?" Sarah asked. "A tactical response team is on standby, but they're based 4 hours away. If we call them in, the Iron Brotherhood will probably scatter before they arrive. If we don't call them and things go bad." He left the sentence unfinished. Sarah studied the map, calculating distances, response times, and tactical options. "Sheriff, I need you to coordinate with state police, but I want them to stage closer than 4 hours away. Not close enough to be obvious, but ready to provide backup if we need it." "You're thinking this is going to escalate beyond what we can handle." "I'm thinking the Iron Brotherhood's leadership is smart enough to learn from their mistakes. They underestimated us once. They won't do it again." Dave's computer chimed with an incoming message. He read it quickly, then looked up with concern. "We've got a problem. One of our regional contacts reports that the Iron Brotherhood just purchased some serious hardware from black market sources. Night vision equipment, body armor, automatic weapons." Maria whistled softly. "They're not coming back for intimidation. They're coming for war." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. When she had intervened to protect Emma and the coffee shop, she had been thinking about stopping local thugs from terrorizing small businesses. Now she was looking at the possibility of an armed conflict that could put the entire town at risk. "Jake, honest assessment. What are we looking at in terms of enemy force projection?" Jake consulted his notes. "Based on intelligence reports, I estimate they can field 20 to 30 people with military-grade equipment. If they're smart, they'll approach from multiple directions simultaneously, target key infrastructure to isolate the town, and use overwhelming force to end resistance quickly." defending against that level of threat would require. Sarah paused, running calculations in her head. Would require more than 4 former SEALs and a 3-person sheriff's department. Jake finished. Unless we level the playing field somehow. Sheriff Martinez looked between them. What does that mean exactly? Sarah made a decision that she knew would change everything. It means we stop reacting to their moves and start taking the initiative. We identify their staging areas, their leadership structure, and their supply lines. Then, we systematically neutralize their ability to threaten this community. You're talking about offensive operations, Sheriff Martinez said carefully. I'm talking about protecting Millbrook by ensuring that the Iron Brotherhood no longer has the capability to attack it. Dave looked up from his computer. Sarah, I've been tracking their communications. They're using encrypted cell phones, but the encryption isn't military grade. I can break it, but it'll take some time. How much time? Maybe 12 hours to crack their current communications protocol. Maria was studying satellite imagery on another screen. I think I found their primary staging area. There's an abandoned industrial complex about 30 miles north of here. Lots of recent vehicle traffic, new security measures, and what looks like temporary housing. Sarah moved to look over Maria's shoulder. The satellite images showed a cluster of buildings that would provide excellent cover and concealment for a large group planning operations. More importantly, it was isolated enough that law enforcement wouldn't stumble across it accidentally. That's where they're planning their assault on Millbrook, she said with certainty. Jake, what would you need to conduct reconnaissance on that facility? 4 hours, night vision equipment, and permission to operate outside our current defensive parameters. Sheriff Martinez held up his hand. Wait a minute. Are you talking about leaving Millbrook to spy on criminals at their base? Isn't that beyond what I can authorize as a sheriff? Sarah turned to face him. Sheriff, let me ask you something. In 12 hours, the Iron Brotherhood is probably going to attack this town with automatic weapons, body armor, and 30 trained people. Do you want to wait for them to arrive and fight them in the streets where civilians could be hurt? Or do you want us to gather intelligence that might prevent that attack from succeeding? Sheriff Martinez was quiet for a long moment. If state police asked me how I knew to position resources to intercept an armed assault on Millbrook, what do I tell them? You tell them that you had reliable intelligence about a planned criminal action, and you took appropriate steps to protect your community. And if they ask where that intelligence came from, Sarah smiled grimly. You tell them it came from consultants with specialized expertise in handling organized criminal threats. Dave's computer chimed again. Sarah, you need to see this. I just intercepted a partial communication from the Iron Brotherhood network. They're definitely planning something for tonight. Sarah read the message fragments that Dave had managed to decode. Final preparations complete. Full deployment at 0200 hours. Neutralize resistance leadership. Make example. That settles it, Sarah said. Jake, you and I are going on reconnaissance. Dave, keep working on breaking their communications completely. Maria, coordinate with Sheriff Martinez on positioning state police for support. Sheriff Martinez looked uncomfortable. I have to ask, are you planning to engage the enemy at their staging area, or just gather intelligence? That depends on what we find when we get there, Sarah replied honestly. If we discover evidence that they're about to launch an assault on Millbrook, we'll take whatever action is necessary to prevent it. What if that means combat operations? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Sheriff, I spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL. My job was to locate and neutralize threats to American communities before those threats could harm innocent people. The Iron Brotherhood represents exactly that kind of threat. Jake was already gathering reconnaissance equipment. We'll need to move fast. If they're planning something for tonight, time is critical. As Sarah prepared her own gear, she reflected on how far this situation had escalated. What had started as protecting a coffee shop had become preparation for what amounted to a military operation. But she had learned during her years of service that sometimes the only way to protect peace was to confront those who would destroy it. Emma arrived at the warehouse as Sarah and Jake were completing their equipment checks. She looked tired but determined, carrying a thermos of coffee and a worried expression. I heard from Dave that you're going to spy on the criminals' base tonight, she said without preamble. Something like that, Sarah confirmed. Is this really necessary? Couldn't we just call in more police? Sarah paused in checking her night vision equipment. Emma, the Iron Brotherhood has military equipment and trained personnel. If they attack Millbrook tonight, a lot of innocent people could get hurt. The best way to prevent that is to make sure their attack fails before it starts. What if something happens to you? What if you don't come back? Sarah was touched by the concern in Emma's voice. Jake and I have done this kind of mission dozens of times in much more dangerous places. We'll be back. But what if you're not? What happens to the rest of us? It was a fair question, and Sarah owed her an honest answer. If something happens to us, Dave and Maria will coordinate with Sheriff Martinez and state police to defend the town. But, Emma, we're not going out there to be heroes. We're going to gather intelligence and, if possible, prevent an attack. We're good at this. Jake finished his equipment check, ready to move. Sarah turned to the rest of the team. Dave, if you don't hear from us by 0600 hours, assume we've been compromised and activate all defensive measures. Maria, coordinate with state police for immediate response. Sheriff, be ready to evacuate civilians if necessary. As Sarah and Jake prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson arrived with a group of other community volunteers. The elderly woman who had been terrified by breaking coffee cups a week ago now carried herself with the determination of someone who had decided to fight for her home. Ms. Sarah, she said formally, we wanted you to know that the community is behind you completely. We've organized supply networks, communication systems, and safe houses for anyone who might need them. Sarah felt a surge of emotion that surprised her. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. That means more than you know. We also wanted you to know that we understand what you're risking for us. If there's anything else we can do, just keep everyone safe and be ready to help however you can, Sarah replied. This community's strength has been its best defense all along. As Sarah and Jake departed the warehouse in a vehicle equipped with surveillance gear and communication equipment, Sarah found herself thinking about the transformation she had witnessed in Millbrook over the past week. People who had been living in fear had become active participants in their own defense. Community members who had never spoken to each other before were now coordinating complex support operations. The Iron Brotherhood had intended to intimidate Millbrook into submission. Instead, they had awakened something that criminal organizations feared most, a community that refused to be victimized. The drive to the Iron Brotherhood's staging area took 45 minutes through back roads that avoided main highways and potential checkpoints. Sarah and Jake maintained radio silence except for periodic check-ins with base, knowing that their communications could be monitored. As they approached the industrial complex, Sarah felt the familiar calm that always preceded dangerous operations. This was what she had trained for, what she was good at. The Iron Brotherhood was about to discover that their intelligence about Millbrook's defenses was incomplete. Jake parked the vehicle 2 miles from the complex, and they proceeded on foot using night vision equipment to navigate in complete darkness. The approach took another hour, moving carefully to avoid detection while gathering intelligence about the facility's layout, security measures, and personnel. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. The complex wasn't just a staging area. It was a full military camp with sentries, communication equipment, weapon stockpiles, and detailed maps of Millbrook that showed every building, every street, and every potential defensive position. Count 35 personnel, Jake whispered into his throat microphone. Military-grade weapons, body armor, night vision equipment. This isn't a criminal gang anymore. It's an armed assault force. Sarah studied the facility through her scope, cataloging threats and opportunities. Jake, they've got maps showing civilian locations. They're not planning to just intimidate the town. They're planning to occupy it. What's the call? Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of the operation. We neutralize this threat before it can reach Millbrook. Tonight, the reconnaissance mission had just become something much more serious, and the stakes had risen beyond anything Sarah had originally anticipated. But as she looked at the detailed invasion plans spread across tables in the Iron Brotherhood's command center, she knew there was no alternative. The battle for Millbrook was about to begin, but it wouldn't be fought in the streets where innocent people could be hurt. It would be fought here, in the darkness, by people who had spent years learning how to protect communities exactly like this one.